Gyms are places where size speaks loudly. Heavy weights, large frames, and visible muscle often decide who gets respect before a single word is spoken. On this particular day, the atmosphere followed that same unspoken rule. Iron clanged, sweat hung in the air, and confidence was measured by mass. Among towering physiques and inflated egos stood Bruce Lee, quiet, compact, and entirely uninterested in attention. That contrast did not go unnoticed. One man, a 250-pound bodybuilder whose presence dominated the room, looked at Bruce Lee and made a judgment that felt obvious to him. Too small. Too light. Too unthreatening. What followed was not a fight, not a display of strength, and not the outcome anyone expected. It was a lesson that unfolded without noise, and it left the entire gym silent. The bodybuilder's confidence had been built slowly and visibly over years of discipline in the gym. Every day spent lifting heavier weights reinforced a simple belief that strength was something obvious, something measurable, something that announced itself the moment a person walked into a room. His body reflected effort, routine, and consistency, and in environments like this, those qualities often become authority. People stepped aside, glances lingered, and respect was assumed without needing to be requested. Size had become his language, and the gym was a place where that language was widely understood. In his world, strength was proven through appearance long before it was ever tested. Broad shoulders suggested dominance, thick arms implied capability, and sheer mass communicated inevitability. These visual signals created a shortcut for judgment, allowing assumptions to form instantly without deeper evaluation. When he scanned the room, he was not looking for awareness, balance, or discipline. He was looking for size. And when his eyes landed on Bruce Lee, what he noticed first was what he believed was missing. Bruce Lee did not fit the physical template the bodybuilder trusted. He was compact, quiet, and unimpressive by the gym's most visible standards. There was no exaggerated muscle definition demanding attention, no inflated posture designed to project dominance, and no outward sign that suggested physical threat. To the bodybuilder, this absence was interpreted as weakness, not because he intended to belittle, but because his understanding of strength had been narrowed over time. What could not be seen immediately was assumed not to exist. That assumption felt natural to him. In environments governed by comparison, judgment often masquerades as certainty. He did not consider that strength might express itself differently, or that control could exist without display. He simply trusted the evidence he valued most, and that evidence told him that Bruce Lee was smaller, lighter, and therefore less capable. From that conclusion, mockery followed almost automatically. The comment he made was not calculated to harm. It was casual, delivered with the ease of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Loud enough to be heard by others, but casual enough to invite agreement rather than confrontation. It carried the tone of someone speaking from an unquestioned position of superiority, assuming laughter would follow as confirmation. In his mind, the remark was harmless, a reflection of reality as he understood it. Around them, the gym continued its rhythm, but attention subtly shifted. People are drawn to moments where hierarchy appears to be tested, even unintentionally. Some listened out of curiosity, others out of expectation. The comment reinforced a familiar narrative that many had accepted without challenge. Bigger means stronger. Smaller means lesser. It was a story that felt comfortable because it required no deeper thought. To the bodybuilder, the moment ended as soon as the words left his mouth. He had spoken from certainty, and certainty rarely feels the need to linger. But to Bruce Lee, the comment was not an insult or a challenge. It was information. It revealed how the bodybuilder understood power, how the room measured strength, and how assumptions formed long before truth was considered. Bruce Lee did not interpret the mockery emotionally. He did not internalize it or prepare to counter it. Instead, he observed it with the same clarity he applied to movement, timing, and balance. He recognized that the bodybuilder's confidence was rooted entirely in appearance, and that belief shaped every conclusion he made. The comment revealed more about the speaker than the subject. This moment illustrates how easily size becomes assumption. When physical presence dominates perception, other forms of strength are overlooked entirely. Discipline becomes invisible. Awareness goes unnoticed. Control is mistaken for absence. The bodybuilder was not intentionally dismissive. He was simply operating within a narrow framework that rewarded visibility over depth. The danger of that framework is subtle. It encourages quick judgments and discourages curiosity. It teaches people to trust what is immediately apparent while ignoring what takes time to understand. In that moment, the bodybuilder's confidence rested on the belief that he already knew everything he needed to know. That belief made mockery feel justified and harmless. Yet, assumptions are fragile, even when they feel solid. They rely on limited information and resist contradiction. What the bodybuilder did not realize was that his certainty had already begun to weaken the moment it was expressed. By reducing strength to size alone, he left no room for nuance, and in doing so, set the stage for a lesson he had not anticipated. Bruce Lee remained quiet, not because he felt diminished, but because there was nothing to correct. The assumption had been made. The judgment had been revealed, and in that stillness, the imbalance between appearance and reality was already present, waiting to be exposed without force. This is how misjudgment begins, not with hostility, but with confidence that has never been challenged, not with cruelty, but with certainty, built on incomplete understanding. The bodybuilder believed size told the whole story. Bruce Lee understood that it rarely does. Bruce Lee did not react in that moment, not because the comment surprised him, and not because he felt uncertain, but because his attention had already moved elsewhere. While others focused on the words that had been spoken, he was observing what surrounded them. He noticed the bodybuilder's posture, how the chest was held forward as a declaration rather than a necessity, and how the stance relied more on presence than balance. He observed the rhythm of his breathing, steady but shallow, revealing confidence rooted in appearance rather than calm awareness. These details mattered more to Bruce Lee than the mockery itself. At the same time, he was aware of the room. He noticed how nearby conversations softened, how eyes shifted without fully turning, and how the atmosphere subtly tightened as people waited for a reaction. Gyms are places where attention often moves toward confrontation, even when it begins casually. Bruce Lee sensed that collective anticipation clearly. He understood that the moment no longer belonged only to him and the bodybuilder, but to everyone who had begun to expect an outcome. Instead of responding to the comment, Bruce Lee continued with what he was already doing. His movements remained unhurried, his posture unchanged, and his expression neutral. There was no visible tension in his body and no shift in his focus. This was not an act of dismissal or indifference. It was a deliberate refusal to allow the comment to set the direction of the moment. By not responding, he removed the mockery's ability to shape what happened next. This choice confused more than it reassured. Mockery depends on response. It is designed to provoke either embarrassment or confrontation, both of which confirm the speaker's sense of dominance. When neither appears, the mockery loses its function. Silence interrupts its momentum and exposes its fragility. The bodybuilder expected a reaction that would reinforce his assumption. He expected Bruce Lee to shrink, defend himself, or push back. What he received was none of those things. Bruce Lee's calm created an unexpected pause. In that pause, the room had time to notice what had not happened. There was no visible discomfort, no defensive posture, and no emotional shift. The absence of reaction stood out more than any argument could have. People began to realize that the comment had not landed where it was intended to land. The certainty behind it had not been acknowledged, challenged, or validated. This moment revealed something important. Bruce Lee did not treat the mockery as something that required correction. He did not feel compelled to explain himself or assert his identity. His sense of self was not dependent on external opinion, especially not in a space where judgments were made quickly and superficially. By remaining composed, he demonstrated that the comment had no authority over his internal state. There is a discipline required to do this. Most people feel an immediate urge to respond when they are judged publicly. Silence can feel risky, as if it might be interpreted as weakness or agreement. Bruce Lee understood that reacting too quickly often hands control to the person provoking the response. By waiting, he retained control of the situation and allowed clarity to guide his next step, if any was needed at all. The bodybuilder, meanwhile, began to feel the shift. Without a reaction to anchor his confidence, he became more aware of the attention now resting on him. The silence did not support his assumption. It did not confirm his authority. Instead, it placed him in an uncomfortable position where he was no longer sure how the moment would resolve. The expected script had been interrupted. Bruce Lee's lack of response also revealed a deeper understanding of human behavior. He recognized that not every comment deserves engagement, and that responding often gives unnecessary importance to words that are rooted in assumption rather than truth. By refusing to react, he allowed the moment to reveal itself naturally. The pressure created by the mockery began to dissolve because it was no longer being reinforced. What made this particularly effective was that Bruce Lee did not withdraw or disengage from the environment. He remained present. His awareness stayed open. He did not avoid the situation. He simply did not feed it. This distinction matters. Avoidance suggests fear, while presence without reaction suggests confidence. The room could sense that difference, even if it could not articulate it. As seconds passed, the silence began to speak for itself. It communicated that Bruce Lee was not interested in proving anything, that he did not feel diminished by the comment, and that he trusted his own understanding more than external validation. This quiet assurance contrasted sharply with the bodybuilder's earlier certainty, which now felt less stable. In that moment, Bruce Lee showed that response is a choice, not an obligation. He demonstrated that awareness allows a person to decide whether engagement adds value or simply escalates tension. By choosing not to respond, he maintained clarity and allowed the situation to unfold without being driven by impulse. This is why Bruce Lee did not respond, not because he lacked confidence, but because he possessed enough of it to remain still. He understood that the strongest position is often the one that does not rush to speak, react, or defend. By doing nothing, he preserved control and allowed the moment to reveal its true nature without interference. As the seconds stretched on, something subtle but unmistakable began to change in the room. The comment that was meant to spark laughter or provoke reaction failed to land the way it was intended. Any smiles that appeared faded almost immediately, as if people sensed that responding too quickly would place them on the wrong side of a moment they did not yet understand. The humor felt unfinished, suspended in the air without support. Silence filled the space where laughter was supposed to settle, and that silence carried weight. The bodybuilder felt this shift before he fully understood it. At first, his confidence remained intact, supported by habit and expectation. But as no response came from Bruce Lee, his certainty began to lose its footing. He became aware that the attention he had briefly directed outward was now slowly returning to him. Without resistance to confront, his posture no longer felt as secure. Confidence, when it depends on reaction, weakens quickly when reaction does not appear. People nearby sensed the change as well. Conversations that had paused did not resume. Eyes lingered longer than before. No one said anything, yet everyone felt that something important was unfolding quietly. The moment was no longer defined by the original comment, but by what followed it. Or more accurately, by what did not follow. The absence of response created an opening that allowed the situation to evolve in an unexpected direction. Bruce Lee's calm presence began to reshape the atmosphere in ways that physical size never could. He had not corrected the remark, offered justification, or challenged the assumption behind it. There was no visible attempt to reclaim respect or assert dominance. Instead, his composure remained steady, unaltered by the attention now circulating through the room. That steadiness introduced a new point of reference, one that was not based on comparison or display. The bodybuilder, now more conscious of being observed, experienced an unfamiliar sensation. Without a clear outcome, he could not rely on the narrative he had expected to unfold. His comment was meant to place him above the situation, but the lack of response prevented that positioning from solidifying. The confidence that had felt automatic moments earlier now required effort to maintain, and effort, when noticed, signals vulnerability. What made this shift invisible yet powerful was its gradual nature. There was no dramatic confrontation to mark the change. No raised voices or decisive gestures announced a turning point. Instead, the room slowly recalibrated itself. Authority began to feel less tied to physical presence and more tied to composure. The certainty that once surrounded the bodybuilder's size softened, replaced by curiosity and quiet reassessment. Bruce Lee's stillness created a tension that could not be resolved through strength alone. Normally, tension in such spaces dissipates through action, either by escalation or resolution. Here, neither occurred. The lack of response prevented the moment from moving forward along familiar lines. Without opposition, dominance lost its relevance. The situation lingered, suspended by uncertainty rather than controlled by force. This uncertainty affected everyone differently. Some felt discomfort, unsure of how to interpret what they were witnessing. Others felt intrigue, sensing that something deeper was being demonstrated without explanation. A few felt a quiet respect forming, not because they had seen a display of power, but because they had witnessed restraint under scrutiny. The room, once governed by visible hierarchy, now felt less certain of where authority truly resided. The bodybuilder in particular became aware that his earlier certainty had been exposed. Without a reaction to validate it, his assumption stood alone, unsupported. He could sense that continuing in the same direction would only draw more attention to the imbalance that had emerged. The moment was no longer about Bruce Lee's size. It had become about presence, control, and the ability to remain unaffected. Bruce Lee's calm did not overpower the space. It stabilized it. While others adjusted internally, he remained unchanged. That consistency contrasted sharply with the shifting emotional state around him. People often associate power with the ability to influence others, but influence does not always require action. Sometimes it emerges simply by remaining steady when others are unsettled. The longer the silence persisted, the clearer it became that the original hierarchy had lost its hold. The bodybuilder's size had not disappeared, but its significance had diminished. In its place, awareness took precedence. The room had begun to recognize that strength could exist without display, and that authority could be felt without being asserted. This invisible shift marked the true turning point of the encounter. Not because anyone had won or lost, but because the framework through which the situation was understood had changed. The assumption that size alone commanded respect no longer felt complete. The moment had exposed the limitations of that belief without needing to challenge it directly. Bruce Lee did not need to speak for this shift to occur. His presence alone allowed the room to see beyond surface-level judgment. By refusing to engage, he revealed how quickly confidence collapses when it relies on reaction rather than substance. The silence did not embarrass anyone, but it clarified something essential. When the moment finally moved on, it did so quietly, without resolution or announcement. Yet the effect lingered. The room returned to its rhythm, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. Something unspoken had been understood. Authority had been redefined, not through confrontation, but through composure. This is how the invisible shift happens. It does not arrive with force or spectacle. It emerges gradually, through the absence of what was expected and the presence of what was not. Bruce Lee's calm had altered the balance of the room, proving that sometimes the most decisive change occurs without a single visible action. The moment reached a point where interaction could no longer be avoided, not because Bruce Lee demanded attention or asserted himself, but because the bodybuilder's certainty had begun to weaken under its own weight. The silence that followed the initial comment had altered the atmosphere so completely that continuing as if nothing had happened was no longer possible. The bodybuilder sensed that the confidence he relied on was no longer carrying the authority it once did, and that realization quietly compelled him to engage. When words were finally exchanged, they did not carry the sharpness of confrontation or the energy of rivalry. There was no raised voice, no attempt to dominate the exchange, and no effort to reclaim status through volume or posture. Bruce Lee spoke calmly, his tone steady and unforced, as though the moment required clarity rather than assertion. His words were not designed to impress or intimidate. They were measured, direct, and grounded in understanding rather than comparison. This manner of speaking immediately distinguished him from what the bodybuilder expected. Instead of defensiveness or bravado, Bruce Lee offered composure. Instead of reacting emotionally, he responded thoughtfully. His confidence did not fluctuate with the attention of the room, nor did it depend on how the exchange would be perceived. It was evident that he was not invested in winning a moment, but in maintaining alignment with himself. As the exchange continued, it became increasingly clear that Bruce Lee was not interested in proving anything. He did not seek to justify his presence, explain his background, or validate his ability. There was no urgency in his demeanor, no pressure to convince, and no desire to be recognized. This absence of need was perhaps the most unexpected element of the interaction. In a space where strength was often demonstrated, Bruce Lee allowed it to remain implied. The bodybuilder, accustomed to clear demonstrations of dominance, began to sense something unfamiliar. The usual markers of power were missing, yet authority was present nonetheless. Bruce Lee's presence communicated control without effort, confidence without display, and awareness without tension. These qualities did not announce themselves loudly, but they were unmistakable. They suggested a form of strength that existed independently of comparison or approval. What unfolded in that moment was not a reversal of hierarchy through force, but a quiet redefinition of what strength could look like. Bruce Lee did not diminish the bodybuilder, nor did he elevate himself at another's expense. Instead, he shifted the framework through which the interaction was understood. Strength was no longer measured by size or volume, but by clarity, restraint, and self-possession. This shift was subtle but profound. The bodybuilder began to realize that the confidence he had relied on was conditional, dependent on how others reacted to him. Bruce Lee's confidence, by contrast, appeared self-sustaining. It did not rise or fall with the room's attention. It did not need affirmation to remain intact. That difference exposed a gap between appearance-based strength and internally grounded power. Bruce Lee's calm presence revealed that control does not need to be asserted to be effective. It can exist quietly, shaping interactions without resistance. His awareness was not directed outward in search of dominance, but inward, maintaining balance regardless of circumstance. This kind of awareness cannot be imposed or borrowed. It is cultivated through discipline and self-knowledge, and it reveals itself naturally when challenged. As the exchange concluded, there was no clear victory or defeat, yet something essential had changed. The bodybuilder no longer viewed Bruce Lee through the same lens. The assumption that size alone defines strength no longer felt complete. A broader understanding had emerged, one that acknowledged the limits of physical dominance and the depth of internal mastery. Those who observed the interaction sensed this change as well. The moment did not end with applause or acknowledgement, but with quiet recognition. People returned to their routines, yet the atmosphere carried a different weight. Strength had been demonstrated without demonstration, and authority had been established without demand. This is how strength is quietly redefined. Not through confrontation, but through presence. Not through proving, but through being. Bruce Lee showed that when someone is fully aligned, internally, they no longer need to announce their power. It becomes evident through the way they speak, the way they listen, and the way they remain unchanged when challenged. The gym became more than a place of physical training. It became a space where assumptions were gently dismantled and replaced with understanding. Bruce Lee did not challenge the bodybuilder directly. He allowed the interaction itself to reveal what true strength looked like, and in doing so, he demonstrated that the most enduring forms of power are often the quietest ones. The silence that followed carried a weight that no amount of noise could have matched. It was not awkward or forced, but dense and reflective, as though the room itself had paused to reconsider something it had long taken for granted. Just moments earlier, the gym had been filled with the usual signals of confidence and display, where strength was measured in visible effort and respect followed size almost automatically. Now, that rhythm felt interrupted. People were no longer reacting instinctively. They were thinking. What changed was not the physical environment, but the meaning attached to it. The gym, once driven by ego and outward display, had become a place of quiet observation. Those who had initially looked on with curiosity or anticipation were no longer waiting for entertainment. Their attention had shifted for a different reason. They sensed that something fundamental had moved beneath the surface, something that could not be explained through the familiar language of strength and dominance. The laughter that might have followed the original comment never arrived, because the framework supporting it had collapsed. Humor rooted in comparison depends on shared assumptions. It requires agreement about who holds authority and who does not. In this moment, that agreement dissolved. The idea that size alone determines dominance had been quietly dismantled, not through argument or demonstration, but through presence and composure. As people stood there, they became aware that their own expectations had been challenged. Many had accepted, without question, that physical mass equaled power and that confidence followed visibility. Bruce Lee's response, or lack of one, disrupted that belief. Without raising his voice or asserting himself, he had exposed the limitations of a perspective that relied solely on appearance. That realization made laughter feel inappropriate, almost out of place. The bodybuilder felt this shift more acutely than anyone else. The silence reflected something back to him that he had not intended to reveal. His comment, once spoken from certainty, now seemed to carry unintended meaning. It revealed how heavily his confidence relied on external markers and how quickly that confidence weakened when those markers lost relevance. The attention that had once supported him now felt questioning rather than affirming. He recognized that the remark had said far more about his own assumptions than about Bruce Lee. It exposed a reliance on surface-level judgment and a narrow definition of power that left no room for discipline, awareness, or restraint. This realization was not humiliating, but sobering. It forced an internal reassessment that could not be ignored. Bruce Lee, meanwhile, remained unchanged. He had not shifted posture, altered tone, or claimed authority. Yet the outcome had already been decided. Without engaging physically or verbally, he had influenced the entire dynamic of the room. His calm presence had reoriented attention away from spectacle and towards substance. People were no longer measuring strength by what they could see, but by what they could feel. The absence of laughter signaled a collective understanding. It showed that the moment was no longer about comparison or mockery. It had become about awareness. Those watching sensed that responding lightly would diminish what had been revealed. The silence allowed the lesson to settle without interference, giving it depth and permanence. This kind of shift does not happen often, especially in environments where performance and visibility dominate. It requires someone willing to step outside the expected role without forcing change. Bruce Lee did exactly that. By refusing to play into the dynamic, he allowed its flaws to surface naturally. The room adjusted not because it was instructed to, but because it could no longer maintain the illusion it had relied on. The bodybuilder understood now that strength based solely on appearance is fragile. It depends on agreement and reinforcement. Once that reinforcement disappears, so does its authority. Bruce Lee's presence had quietly withdrawn that reinforcement, leaving only the truth of the situation behind. No confrontation was necessary. No demonstration was required. The imbalance corrected itself. People returned to their routines eventually, but the atmosphere did not fully return to what it had been. Something subtle lingered, a shared awareness that power can exist without display, and that dominance does not always announce itself. The silence had done more than end a moment. It had altered perception. This is why no one laughed anymore, not because they were afraid, but because they understood. They had witnessed a quiet dismantling of assumption and a redefinition of strength that did not rely on force. The moment had passed, but its lesson remained, embedded in the stillness that followed and carried forward in the way the room now understood power. What stayed with the people in that gym was not fear, and it was not admiration either. It was something quieter and far more enduring. It was understanding. They had not witnessed a dramatic confrontation or a visible display of dominance. Instead, they had seen confidence dissolve without being challenged, ego lose its grip without being attacked, and authority shift without anyone raising a voice. The lesson unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, and that is what made it so powerful. Everyone present had entered the moment carrying assumptions they were barely aware of. Strength meant size. Confidence meant volume. Control meant the ability to impose oneself on others. These ideas had shaped how they watched the interaction from the beginning. Yet what they observed contradicted those beliefs without directly opposing them. There was no argument to reject and no action to dispute. The lesson arrived through contrast rather than confrontation. Silence, in this case, proved more instructive than strength ever could. It forced reflection where reaction would have ended the moment quickly. People began to recognize how often they confuse appearance with capability, and how easily they accept visible confidence as proof of authority. This realization did not come with discomfort or embarrassment, but with clarity. It felt less like being corrected, and more like seeing something clearly for the first time. Bruce Lee did not attempt to educate anyone. He did not explain philosophy or justify his approach. He did not seek to be understood or acknowledged. He simply remained himself, grounded and composed, and that consistency exposed the instability of assumptions built on size alone. Without trying to teach, he allowed the situation to teach on its own. The bodybuilder, too, walked away changed in a way that could not be measured immediately. He did not leave humiliated or diminished. He left thoughtful. The realization that his confidence depended heavily on external validation stayed with him. It revealed how narrow his definition of power had been, and how easily certainty can collapse when it is not supported by self-awareness. This was not a loss, but an opportunity to see strength from a broader perspective. For the rest of the room, the lesson lingered quietly. People returned to lifting weights, resuming conversations, and continuing their routines, yet something had shifted beneath the surface. The gym felt the same, but it was not experienced the same way. Awareness had been introduced where assumption once lived. Some may not have fully articulated what they had learned, but they felt it. The idea that power must always be loud no longer felt complete. Moments like this rarely announce their significance. They do not demand attention or recognition. They settle into memory slowly, resurfacing later in different situations. Someone might recall it during a disagreement, choosing silence instead of escalation. Another might remember it when feeling underestimated, realizing that composure carries its own authority. The lesson continues working long after the moment itself has passed. Bruce Lee did not win anything in the conventional sense. He did not dominate a challenge, silence an opponent with force, or prove superiority through action. Yet he altered the outcome entirely. By remaining aligned with himself, he demonstrated that strength does not need to oppose in order to influence. Sometimes it only needs to exist steadily enough for others to recognize its presence. This is why the lesson lingered. It was not tied to a single event, but to a deeper understanding of power and control. People realize that ego often collapses on its own when it is not reinforced, and that silence can reveal more truth than confrontation ever could. They saw that authority rooted in awareness outlasts authority rooted in appearance. The room eventually returned to its rhythm, but not to its previous assumptions. Something subtle remained, an unspoken recognition that strength has many forms, and not all of them demand attention. The experience did not change the environment physically, but it changed how it was perceived. That change is difficult to explain because it happens internally. This is how meaningful lessons endure. They do not shock or impress, they clarify. They replace assumption with understanding, and leave behind a quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself. In that gym, on that day, no one left with a story of victory or defeat. They left with insight, and that insight, once gained, does not easily fade. This was the lesson that lingered after. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. When the moment finally passed, nothing dramatic remained on the surface. The weights continued to move, conversations resumed, and the gym returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet, beneath that normality, something had changed. What lingered was not tension, not embarrassment, and not admiration, but a quiet shift in understanding. People had witnessed a form of strength that did not need to compete, a confidence that did not rise to challenge, and an authority that existed without announcement. What Bruce Lee revealed was not superiority, but clarity. He showed that power does not always appear in confrontation, and that dominance does not always come from imposing oneself on others. Sometimes, the most influential presence is the one that remains steady when everything else expects reaction. By refusing to engage on those terms, he allowed the illusion of size-based authority to dissolve on its own. This is why the lesson stayed with everyone who witnessed it. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was undeniable. Ego lost its grip without being attacked. Confidence collapsed without resistance. And silence, steady and composed, became the most instructive voice in the room. No one needed to explain what happened. They felt it. True strength does not chase validation or demand recognition. It shapes moments quietly, leaving behind understanding rather than spectacle. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is not to prove who they are, but to remain who they are when the world expects something else. That is what stayed behind long after the moment ended.